Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission and the Ephrata Cloister Associates, we'd like to welcome you to tonight's Ephrata Virtual Academy. My name is Elizabeth Berthod, and I am the Historic Site Administrator at Ephrata Cloister. Ephrata was founded in 1732 by a German immigrant named Comrade Beisel. Consisted of celibate members who lived on the property of the historic site, as well as householder members who lived on their own farms surrounding the area. Education was always an important aspect of Ephrata Cloister, and our mission just continues that longstanding educational tradition. This evening's program is a precursor for this weekend's amazing architecture of Ephrata program that we'll be doing, special event we'll be doing. We'll have upstairs tours. Our speaker, in fact, will be leading some outside architecture tours as well. And more information on that event and how to sign up for those upstairs tours is on our website. And I will put the link for that in the chat box, and also the link for the online registrations for that if you wanted to get tickets ahead of time. Tonight, we are joined by Mike Emery, who is the Historic Site Administrator at the Ephrata Cloister. He's also a German scholar, a joint author of several books out there, so we're very lucky to have Mike on our team tonight. He's going to talk a little bit about Pennsylvania German architecture, exploring construction materials and techniques with discussions about exteriors and interiors, roofing, basements, fireplaces, stoves, windows, doors, hardware, you name it. Mike's going to touch base on it. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Mike.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. As Elizabeth said, I hope to be able to talk about all of these different parts of Pennsylvania German architecture, but to be quite honest, I have a very aggressive talk, so we'll see how far we will get through all of this before we call this an end. So, my name is Mike Emery. I started out life in PHMC working at the Daniel Boone Homestead. Then I worked at the Conrad Weiser Homestead, spent 13 years at Landis Valley. Now I'm site administrator of Cornwall Iron Furnace. So that's given me a lot of opportunity to look at historic architecture. And I've always had a real interest in historic architecture. So I've given a lot of talks on general Pennsylvania German architecture. A lot of that is about floor plans, how houses were used and how floor plans kind of affected, houses use. This is a little bit different. This is mainly going to be talking about what was used for the construction of, talk a little bit about some just generalities about some of these Pennsylvania German buildings, but also some really good examples of some of the things that we're going to talk about. So if I can get everything started here. There we go. So I just wanted to make a couple of foundational statements about the Pennsylvania Germans in general. And of course, this all relates to the architecture. That first, the Pennsylvania Germans, or as you would prefer, many prefer Pennsylvania Dutch, the culture is a hybrid culture. It's not only purely German, but it was influenced and affected by these people when they came into Pennsylvania and then other places beyond Pennsylvania. And of course, they were not existing in a vacuum, so that there were all of these outside forces that were influencing many different things. Everything from language to foods they ate, furniture they're using, but also the houses, the barns, and the outbuildings that they're building. They're not taking what they had in Germany and directly building it in the United States. There are changes that come. So we'll explore a little bit of that. Also, the Pennsylvania Germans were never a monolith or a monolithic culture. There were always divisions. There were divisions, by economics. There are many different ways in which they're differentiated. And that's kind of the next point, that Pennsylvania Germans experience differentiation from region, time period. You know, I'm talking about this in generalities over a fairly long time period, about 150 years, economic standing, and many other ways. You know, talking about Ephrata, religion was another one. So this is not a monolithic culture, and there are other outside factors that are influencing all of this. So let's just start with a very general view of a Pennsylvania German landscape. So this is a drawing that was done by an artist by the name of Charles Lesueur in the mid-1820s of the village in Stouchburg, which is in western Berks County. So if you look at this very, quick sketch of this town, which, by the way, isn't much larger than when this was sketched in the 1820s, one of the first things you see over on the right-hand side is this predominance of log architecture. So log architecture is what really you saw most on the landscape early on. So this is a drawing by Lewis Miller of York in York County of the Geiger family. So notice the log buildings in the background, including this center chimney log house. So this is one of the most common house forms and in the most common building material for PA Germans. So studies conducted on the 1798 direct tax in Lancaster County shows that approximately in the German townships, about 2/3 of all of the houses that were surveyed at that time period were one-story log houses. So again, this is what most people are living in, even at the end of the 18th century. So log was a common building material in Pennsylvania, but also where Pennsylvanians moved later on. So if you go into the Valley of Virginia, if you go into Ohio and to the west there. So this is a technology that's taken with them. Now, this was not something that if you go into the Rhineland Faults that you find. You do not find a lot of log buildings there. You find stone, you find half timber. So almost right away, this is one of those pieces that's a hybrid, that's something, and we're really not 100% sure. There are several architectural historians and there are several different theories on where all of this log architecture comes from. But again, this is what they're using, but this is something that was an adaptation very early on in Pennsylvania. So log houses were not always left exposed, either as they were built or certainly as they age. So just like today, people like to remodel their homes and also to update the look. And here are 3 different examples of houses that either have wooden siding on the outside. The one in the upper right, eventually had tar paper put on, probably out of necessity. The one on the bottom left, this, center chimney log house that, probably about 1940 when this photo was taken, had asphalt siding put on the outside of it. But again, all hiding that log house underneath. Now, this is a home with vinyl siding on the main street of Newmanstown in Lebanon County. So question posed to you, was this a house that was built in the post-World War II housing boom, or was it built earlier? Now, there are some clues that we know that this is an earlier log house. It's built on a rubble stone foundation, so that's going to be a very early or very easy way of telling. The center chimney would be atypical. The standing seam metal roof is an older variety. And also the arrangement of the doors and windows, which is architectural historians refer to as fenestration, all point to this as being an earlier house that sometime probably around 1960, 1970, they updated the look. So in Pennsylvania, logs were commonly squared on 2 sides, and that would be the exterior of the house and the interior of the house. The top and bottoms were oftentimes left in the round. And note the axe marks that are on these logs, and that's left over from when these logs are being squared. You also note that the logs were whitewashed, and this was exterior of this building where there was a whitewash put on. Oftentimes the interior, if unplastered, would also be whitewashed. You can also see that in between these logs are stones that are installed on a diagonal. The chinking is a mortar, or I'm sorry, the daubing is a mortar made of clay, lime, and a binder. Usually either it's a straw or an animal hair. And then usually in a finished house, these stones would also be covered up with daubing as well. So this is a home that's located on Brubaker Valley Road near Brickerville. So note that this house, particularly the lower photo, has much more common chinking that you see in between, which is wood. So oftentimes these were pieces that were off-falls left over from the process of hewing. So this house, though, shows kind of a rarer way of construction in a log house. So it's using posts. So oftentimes this is referred to as a corner post log house. And the logs have tenons that are cut on their ends, and they are connected with the upright posts that have mortises. And of course, this would all be held in place with wooden pegs. So this is a construction technique that appears to be a hybrid of the more traditional half timbering that was used in houses, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And that would be, what you'd see common in Germany, and log home construction that would be used in Pennsylvania. So this is kind of a hybrid that you see, but an interesting example, not unique, but an interesting example.
Mike, we have a question. Since you're on the chinking, I'll just go ahead and ask.
Sure, go ahead.
For what reason would they have used stone chinking over the better insulation of wood?
Sometimes you'll see an entire building that will use chinking in stone. Though oftentimes if a log building has gable-ended fireplaces, they'll put stone chinking on the ends that have the fireplaces. And I think it's just because that's an area that if fire would happen to go from the chimney and just touch that wall a little bit, where that would be a place that would be very susceptible to fire. So I think in some cases that's why it's used. In other areas, I think it was just a preference. They had stone that was readily there and available, and that was just a personal preference. So on this slide, you can see this is a better look of the daubing and the use of corner braces to prevent the house really from racking. On the photo, note the right photo, the use of the marriage marks. And where I have those arrows, they're actually marks that give a Roman numeral 3. Then there are 4 hash marks, and then a V for a 5 on the one. So this would all be put together on the ground or dry fit, and then would be erected. So they need to keep track of them. So they'd number all these things. And that's very common in almost all timber frame construction. Very common if you look in barns. So the Berdelay house, this is a photo of it, is on the property of the Danube Homestead. And these are photos from the 1950s and 60s from HAB, so the Historic American Building Survey. And these are photos prior to this being removed to the Danube Homestead. There are many things we could talk about in this group of photos concerning things like chimney placement, the kicked roof, lots of things. But what I want you to focus on is the notching used in the corner of the house. This is what we call a V notch. So these logs are stacked on top of each other and are only held together by the weight of gravity. So these are not nailed together. It's just the weight of the logs holding the house together. The notching is used primarily so that the logs don't roll off of one another. So this is the most common notch that you see, this V notch. So it's named because on one side there's a V on the top of the log that's cut, and then the one above it, there's a V in the bottom, and they meet and fit. And you also notice that German houses are not built like Lincoln logs. You don't have the ends extend out beyond the corners. They really do stop at a 90-degree angle. So that's something you'll see in all German really traditional houses. So this is another example. So there are several less common notching systems other than the V notch that were used. This is a small log outbuilding near Milbach, Lebanon County, and this is held together by what's known as a dovetail notch. And you could see that this looks very similar to if you were looking at a drawer in a piece of furniture that uses dovetails, or a box that uses dovetails. This is put together really the same way. So a direct transplant from Europe is this use of half timbering, which in Germany is known as Fachwerk. So this photograph is a reproduction of a house that was in the process of being built in Pemaquid, Maine. So obviously not Pennsylvania German, but this is the exact same way that really the German houses would have been built using the same technique. So notice that the framing looks very similar to if you go inside of a local 19th century barn, you'll see the frame framed out very similar to this. So there are still some buildings that stand that utilize this very Germanic construction technique, either in part or in their entirety, including the saw at the Ephrata Cloister. So this is a good example of a half-timbered building that unfortunately no longer stands. This was located very near the Landis Valley Museum in Lancaster County. It was torn down shortly after this photo was taken around 1900. As you could see, the roof line and everything on this building, if it wouldn't have been torn down, it would have fallen down soon thereafter. So these houses were constructed with timbers, but they also needed infill. All that section you see in white was infill in between the timbers. So if you look at the photo, the close-up of the woman who's sitting there, you can see that there are very common infill materials. So in the lower left, you can see there's brick. Next to her, you can see there's stone. And to the right of her, you can see that there is what's known as wattle and daub. So that's literally sticks that are kind of basket wove together, and then this mud mixture is applied over top of it. And that was a very common way of doing this. So this is an example, though, that is standing. This is the 1757 Stegall House, which is just north of the square in Schifferstadt, Lebanon County. It is constructed a half timber on the right-hand side of the building. So if you look at the upper picture, the section there with the porch, that's half timber. The section to the left of that is actually built in log, probably added on around 1780. So under the porch, you can see the timbers, the daubing, and the whitewash, which is put over everything. So in this lower left photo. This house used the infill of wattle and daub. Later, the house was covered with German siding and eventually with asphalt shingles. So in the rightmost photo, note this carved corner post. And at the top, you'll see, I think you can see where my cursor is going. There's a heart, and in the center of that is the date 1757. So this is another example of a half-timbered house, but completely covered over with German siding. So this is the Gamerling Rex House, also north of the square in Schafferstown, Lebanon County. Notice that it also has a shed roof, a stone shed roof addition out the back of the house. So when that was added on, that essentially captured this little area of what the original external exterior of the building looked like. And that's the picture that you see over to the right. So if you'll notice, you have the wooden framing. You have what looks to be brick infill, but it's not. That's actually a plaster that's put over, I think it's wattle and daub in this section. While the plaster is still wet, They scribed in bricks, what looked like bricks, and then using a faux painting technique, painted some of the bricks red, painted some of the bricks black to actually simulate glazed bricks. And that was all there to make it look expensive and help to fool the eye. So this is an 1883 photo of the Red Church, which was located near Orwigsburg, Schuylkill County. The congregation is still there. However, this building is long gone. So this was a timber frayed building with wooden siding. So how does that differ from what we were just looking at? So this never had infill in between the timbers. So this was framed very much like a barn would be framed and then covered over with siding on the outside, and then the inside would be plastered, lath and plastered over. It's interesting because this was a common building technique in both the northern and the southern colonies, but was less frequent in the mid-Atlantic colonies, particularly amongst Pennsylvania Germans. So this is kind of a rare building type, but existed here. So Pennsylvania is really known for its stone houses. In the 1700s, stone houses were the exception in Pennsylvania German areas. That's kind of a strange statement. Because they tended to be larger, they're built of more expensive materials. Only the richer people were building stone houses, so they were the exception and not the rule. But stone houses have, however, survived in a disproportional rate, making them appear to be very common. Houses are very much like archaeology. We're only seeing what survives. So this is the 1719 Christian Herr house near Willow Street, Lancaster County, which is the earliest dated house in Lancaster County. It is built of rubble stone with dash pointing that somewhat obscures the entire shape of the stones. The window frames and the door frames are also made out of stone. Note that the house is a single story, but it has a very steep roof, so it has a 2-level attic under that roof. So a common feature that was used to protect the soft pointing, because this is all just a lime putty pointing that's put on the outside of the building, of the house, was a pent roof. Although gone from these houses, you can note the line of stones called a belt course. Particularly on the left-hand photograph, you can see there's a line of stones above and below the second-story windows. So that stone actually acted as kind of like a flashing or a drip edge for the roofs that would have been below them. So very common, you could see it at the roof line on the left-hand photo, but also one at the lower level. Also, oftentimes, because that was going to be hidden by a roof, the stonework would be a little different because they didn't have to point it the same way. So if you look at the photo on the right-hand side, just above the second-story windows, you'll note that the color of the stone is different. That had a different pointing because it was never going to be seen when that roof was still extant on that building. So this is the 1757 Peter Wentz house located in Worcester Township, Montgomery County. Notice that the pent roofs on this building, so one at the gable and one that encircles the building between the first and second stories. Also notice that the house, that the stonework on this house, particularly the front, is much more regular than the last house that we saw, but even the sides of this building. So cut-shaped stone was more expensive than just rubble stone. So being a good Pennsylvania German and rather thrifty, typically the more expensive stone was only going to be put on the side of the house that would be viewed from the road, or at least the primary facade of the building, which is evidenced by this one. And this is a really good example. So the use of cut stone on primary facades was very common and for a long time period, and also for different sized houses. So the home on the left that you see here is the DeTurk ancillary building. So most likely this was used as a Doughty house or a grandparent's house, and dates from the 1760s. The house on the right this had fronted what was known as the Great Road to Allentown and is known as the Dries House. And that was built in 1852 and was most likely just a rental house that was on a property. Even it has a cut stone facade and rubble stone sides. So one last look at stone homes. This is the 1745 Heinrich Zeller house near Newmanstown, Lebanon County. This is probably one of the most direct transplant houses from Germany to Pennsylvania. We could have easily just talked about this building the entire way. Some of the favorite things that I love about this building are the cut sandstone surrounds that are decorative that go around the doorways. Also, that front door is original. That chevron door, which is a Pennsylvania Dutch door split in the center, original to the house as well. So a really great house. And that's near, again, Newmanstown, Lebanon County. So brick was generally the most expensive material, building material in the 1700s, at least in the Pennsylvania Dutch country. So as such, there are few homes built of this material in this period. Those that survive tend to be in more what we could call, at least in a rural area, call an urban setting. So these would appear more in villages and towns. So the house that's in the upper left is a very rare center chimney one-story example of a brick house that unfortunately is now gone, but at one time stood in the village or the town of Womelsdorf in Berks County. The other two houses that you see are still standing, and they're in Strasburg. But again, brick is something that you just tend not to see because it was a very expensive material. So as brick became more affordable in the 1800s, or at least by like the middle third of the century, you start to see more houses in rural areas made out of stone, but you will even start to see brick barns and brick outbuildings being built as well. So this plain couple stands in front of their two front door example. So this is probably middle of the 19th century, and this is in Ephrata Township. This was a really common housing type in the Lancaster County area at that time. So every house needs a door for entrance and egress. The issue is how to support the weight of a building now that you put a hole in it. So the weight must be supported and transferred, and that can be done in a couple of different ways. So timber buildings usually utilize a wooden header above the opening. The top photo shows how this was done at Ephrata. The bottom photo is of a 1740 carved example from a house that's long demolished that once stood in East Petersburg, Lancaster County, and this is one that comes out of the Lancaster or out of the Landis Valley collection. The date is in the bottom right, and it has a saying that's over the door. So here are some examples of this in stone building. So the entry, the Herr house, used a similar method to the log Berdelay house, where you have a lintel that goes over top of them. The other stone homes that you see on here use variations of either some sort of masonry arch that's either out of stone or brick. So again, you have to support that. You just can't punch a hole in the side of the house and expect it to be there. So oftentimes in these very early examples, you see that done with some sort of an arch. So in the Georgian and federal periods, much of that support structure, however, becomes obscured with decorative moldings. So all of these openings or these doorways are using either headers or arches, but again, all hidden behind this much more decorative. In this case, all of these are early 19th century examples, some of which are in Oley. There's a church in Berks County. Matter of fact, yes, the other two are in Oley as well.
Mike, before you go any further, the house that you had in the Ephrata Township with the two folks standing out front had the two front doors.
Yes.
Can you address, we have a question about that. Can you address the two front door situation?
Sure. Where that usually happens is that the one door leads into kind of a common room. Oftentimes, in some instances, it's utilized as a kitchen, Other times is utilized as kind of like a family parlor or sometimes a combination of both. The other door goes directly into a fancy parlor. And this was a German way of dealing with not putting a hallway in a house that you can then essentially segment what people see when they enter a home. So if you enter a house with a central hall, you walk in and that person can lead you into whatever room you see, and you can have any mess in any other room, lead them directly into the best parlor, and they don't know that you're a bad housekeeper. The way the Germans did it is like, well, why waste the space on a hallway? What we're going to do is just take a second entrance, put it directly into that good parlor so you can bring people directly into that room, not waste the space of a hall. And in order to balance it, because this was now, middle of the 19th century, people wanted to balance facades, you stuck the two doors next to one another. So usually this is either a 3 or a 4 room variant of that style of house, but good question. If you really want to see some examples, there are actually several examples at Landis Valley, the Landis Brothers house, which they give tours of all the time. It's a very good example of a 2 front door house. And that one I think was built in like the 1870s. So another common feature of usually also stone homes are date stones or date boards. So these are some different examples. They date anywhere from 1759 to the one in the bottom center to 1885, which is the one in the upper right. I love the one in the upper right because it essentially gives an entire recitation of the ownership of that house up until that time and what everyone built as they did it. The date board, which is in the upper left, is actually the date board on that same house from when the original period of construction was. Notice also that board is painted, but so is the date stone in the center, and that's a Lebanon County example. So windows were needed for the utilization of the #1 source of light in the 18th century, and of course it's still the same source of #1 source of light today, which was the sun. So again, holes in walls need to be supported, and this shows a number of ways that this was done in stone buildings, utilizing again either everything from a high sprung arch to flatter arches and in stone and also in brick, just done in different ways. So here are 3 examples of window pediments that were done in the Georgian style. The example on the left is wood. The example on the right is actually done out of cut stone. So on a much finer house, and that would have been a very expensive piece to put onto that house. So while all the previous windows that we looked at were vertical sliding sash windows, early German windows tended to be casement windows that were made out of either wood or were held in place by lead cames. The casement window on the right is an example from the Ephrata Cloister. The window on the left had a fixed window on the top with 2 casement windows down below. And this was a window that was documented by G. Edwin Brumbaugh near Richland, Lebanon County. Unfortunately, it no longer exists, though I believe the house still does. So let's move on to roofing. So early Germanic houses were noted for their steeply pitched roofs that often accommodated multi-level attics. This drawing is of the framing system of the Johannes Lescher house in Ole, Berks County. Some things to notice. The principal rafter. So that's that really big heavy rafter that's kind of here in the center, supported what was known as a purlin, which is this horizontal piece that's going across here. That's underneath every one of the rafters, including the common rafters. And also note the false rafters. Those are the pieces on the ends of the common rafters. And that's what gives these Germanic houses their kick to the roofs. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we see a better example. So this is the image of a principal rafter in an attic. So note how much heavier this is in compared to the common rafters that it's supporting. So this roof system was designed to handle heavy loads and increase the support over larger spans. They are common in larger houses, but also, of course, in barns. Usually there are 2 to 4 pairs of these in the roofing structure. This tended to be something that is all but gone in houses and buildings built after about 1800. So this is a drawing of the much smaller German Stegall House, which of course dates to 1757. So a house of this size really only needed a common rafter system. But you can see that there's a purlin in this drawing, and I think that has as much to do with supporting those common rafters. It has more to do with the walls. So again, that we don't have that racking, but it's also there to help support those common rafters. And that purlin will run from the gable end of the building, gable to gable. And oftentimes in smaller buildings is one piece of wood. In larger buildings, that's interrupted, but goes in between those principal rafters. So this image shows a detail of a false rafter. And you can see that that's that little piece that's attached underneath of the roof. And what that does by putting that false rafter on, it changes the pitch of the roof for that small run. And thereby that's what gives that roof its distinctive kick. You know, in some instances, you know, just for simplicity's sake, it kind of is shaped like a witch's hat, where it goes at one pitch, and then at the bottom, the pitch is less. So you kind of see these 2 different pitches, and only for the bottom couple of feet of a roof. So roof tiles were something that was a direct transfer from Germany, and also something that fell out of favor after about 1800. So the tiles are made out of the same material that you make brick out of. So typically, brick and tile makers were the same person. Would be located often close to urban centers, but there were some like in Ole that were a little bit more out in the country. These were expensive. They're heavy. They're also fragile. So what happened is that as tile makers died off, there was no one there to replace them. So oftentimes these houses would have trees around them. So one branch comes down, hits the roof, smashes a bunch of tiles, no replacements. They ended up on smaller and smaller and smaller roofs. So the image that we have here, this is of a small building that was in Bethlehem. And I believe this is an image that was actually taken by Henry Landis when he was in college. So these flat tiles are on a bake oven roof at the Danube homestead. And you can see they're laid in straight rows and they're not staggered. So that's very different to our eyes. I remember the first time I saw these, I'm like, what's wrong with the roof? What's different? Straight rows and not staggered. So the design is intended to gather water in the center of the tile and then place it into the center of the next tile. And then it does that all the way off the roof. Also notice the ridge tiles that are rounded on the roof line, on the roof ridge. So at one time, these tiles were made for homes. And there are just a couple of houses left that have either all or part of their 18th century tile roofs. But most of these, if you're going to see them today, they exist on much smaller outbuildings, very common on smokehouses and bake ovens.
Well, before you move on here, we have a question about the purpose of the kick roof and another question about when slate was started to be used.
Okay, good picture. Let me just go back. So if you look at the kicked roof, part of it is just, if you look at where the common rafter comes down to a plate, okay? So that plate is even with the end wall. So without putting a false rafter on there, you actually have a very shallow roof. And again, soft materials on the buildings. And I remember taking preservation classes and they said, you know, WWW, water will win. So what you're doing is attempting to push the water further away from the building. That's the exact same reason why they're also putting pent roofs on these buildings, push water as far away as possible. So by putting that false rafter on, you're able to add a couple of foot of rafter, and that then pushes the water further away from the building. I'm sorry, what was the other question, Elizabeth?
When did slate begin to be
Thank
used?
you. Slate is really something in our area that we don't really see until the 19th century. That's something that comes in a little bit later. So in early buildings, we don't see it here, but in other places it was used very early. I remember, I believe when John Hancock, or I'm sorry, it was one of the founding fathers in Boston. It might have been John Hancock now that I think about it. There was a house that was looted there at the very kind of beginning of the revolution. And one of the things that said the revolutionaries did is go, well, it wasn't Hancock's house, obviously. It was I guess a prominent Tory in that area. They went up into the attic and they smashed the slate roof from the inside using like poles to break it off. So, you know, there was an example in New England, but a relatively fine house. But I've never really seen any of that being used until like middle third of the 19th century locally. So that's another heavy, expensive roofing material, and it also tends to be on works best on a steeper pitch roof. If it's too shallow, kind of like the tiles, they'll much more prone to leak. So this is a photo of the underside of the same tiled roof that I showed you on the bake oven. And you can see the tiles are simply held in place by gravity. So note that there are lugs at the top of every one of those tiles, and that lug just simply slips over top of that horizontal piece of wood. The weight of the tile and the weight of the tile above it are really the only thing that's holding it on. The other thing you'll notice is that you can see daylight for the most part between the tiles. It looks like a system that should in no way, shape, or form ever work, but for the most part, it works. It's a pretty decent system for roofing. So wood shingles were the most common roofing material used in the 1700s and the 1800s. Wood was widely available and was also inexpensive. So these are known as side-lapped or long shingles, and these are on these are roofs of buildings, the barn and the log house at Landis Valley Museum. So a single nail would be placed at the bottom of each one of these shingles, but because the way they're lapped to the side and top to bottom, a single nail then usually pierces 6 shingles. So this is the roofing material that you'll see on many of the buildings at the Ephrata Cloister today. And there have been many period examples that have been found on buildings, either under old roofing or in areas when additions were put on that old roofing survived. So there's actually lots of evidence of the use of this throughout our area of Pennsylvania. So thatch was also used as a roofing material. In some places, like in the UK, they use reed. Other places, they might use rushes. Pennsylvania Germans use rye straw. But usually it was not used on houses. It tended to be on agricultural buildings. So things like this is a hay barrack that's at Landis Valley Museum. Commonly, you see references to barns, even large barns being thatched. But it appears that by about the Civil War time period, this is something that is really on the way out. There's a really good story around Landis Valley where there was a storm that came and blew a thatch roof off a barn in like 1867, the Long Barn, and they replaced it with wood. This is an example of a board or plank roofed building. So this is another building material that seemed to be used in the 18th century, primarily on agricultural buildings. So this is an 18th century ground barn that was located near Joanna Furnace in Berks County, and this was photographed in the 1870s. And you could see that where the men are standing there to the right, those are doors for livestock to go in and out. But if you see the guy in the window looking out, you'll notice that the logs up top, there's no chinking and daubing in between them. That's for hay storage. That allows for a little bit of air circulation so that the hay doesn't sweat either catch on fire or mold. So because large structures often had steeply pitched roofs, additional windows were needed to light what was often used as living space. So note the long row of shed roof dormers on this building that's in Bethlehem, but also you can see below that one of the buildings at Ephrata. So again, when you have attic space that's being used as living space, you need to light it. So oftentimes this was the style of dormer, which they did that with. So let's leave the attics and let's go on to the basements. So most Pennsylvania German houses had at least a partially excavated basement, which was for the purpose of cold food storage. So this well-stocked basement is from the 1780s Eggy House at Charming Forge, which was near Wilmersdorf, Berks County. Many early substantial homes would utilize an arched cellar in the basement. Sometimes, though, they would also have a standalone arched cellar that would be built nearby in the yard. Note the brick arch at the opening of the cellar. Usually stone is what these would be constructed out of, the entire thing, and then whitewashed because of the food. The example I have a photo of was one that, as you could see, hadn't been used for a long time, fairly dirty. So going to the basement, oftentimes there were internal stairs, and they would lead usually from the kitchen of the house. This is the Lice House, which dates also to around 1780 and is located in Host, Berks County. And you'll note that the stairs are also made out of stone. Oftentimes you would have wood treads and stringers and risers that would be there, but this example is all made out of stone. So many homes also had exterior entrances to get to the basement, and this was in order to move very large things into the basement. Oftentimes you'll see in estate inventories many barrels of things like cider that would be stored in the basement, and a barrel of cider is pretty heavy, so you need an easy way to get it in there. So this is a wall niche that would be very common in basement. Unlike the attic, which had all of those windows, oftentimes basements relatively have very few, if any, windows. So if you're going to work in an area where you have all of this food, you need some light. So oftentimes this was a place where a lamp would be put so that you could then see what was going on in the basement. Another feature that you'll oftentimes see in these basements are supports for either fireplaces or stoves. This is an example of a stove support. You can see that it's like a corbel that's hanging out of this. This would have had several other layers of stone. This most likely supported a jam or a 5-plate stove. Another feature that's rather unique to a lot of early Pennsylvania German houses is the idea of an insulated basement. So in the floor, or between the first floor and the basement, oftentimes you would have wooden flooring, and then you would have the floor joists that would hold that up. But in between those joists, they would then have a mixture. Usually it was clay, lime, a binding material, oftentimes straw, that would fill up a void that was there. The image to the right, they've actually put nailers on either side of a floor joist and then put other pieces of wood in, and that space in between was then filled with this mixture. The example on the left, that's done with wrapped pieces of wood that are slid into that, and then that entire thing would be mudded up and then whitewashed to try to give a little more light in the basement as well. So let's move on to the first floor of the house and into the kitchen. So this is a cooking fireplace to the 1780 Lice House. Note the cut stones on the side of the fireplace. And you can also see that there's a niche inside of that as well. So many of these houses, the Pennsylvania German houses, you would walk into the kitchen. So this would be one of the first things that you would see. And this would be usually lit by maybe a single window, this large walk-in fireplace, and this is where all the cooking was taking place. So this is actually the pot crane from that same fireplace. A little unusual. This is, of course, a wrought iron crane that would have been there to hold pots, and you would have had trammels that would have allowed you to change distances between the pots and the floor. And this has notches in it, so that it would actually, it wouldn't slide very easily, so it would go into a notch, so you couldn't accidentally kind of knock it off of the fire. So this is another example of a cooking fireplace. This time, this is in the Berdeley House in Ole Berks County. Behind this 19th century kind of butchering apparatus that you see there, there's actually a wooden crane, which is a very rare survivor that would have been utilized over a slightly raised hearth to be able to do cooking there. And some other examples of kitchen fireplaces. The one on the left has a slightly raised hearth. The one on the right, though, I just wanted you really to see the decoration. That's a reconstruction of the original paint in the Gamerling Rex House in Schifferstadt. That red is very common for a kitchen color. And then they used just a white paint and probably some sort of like a potato as a stamp to then stamp all of this onto the walls. So not what you would expect. So this is one of the fireplaces at Ephrata. Note you had a very small raised hearth like you did in the last photo, but also this kind of soup hearth with a soup and herd that's in the back that would allow you to go ahead and put fire under a fairly large kettle. So these are some of the fireplaces in the upper floors of the Sarin. So again, note the raised hearths, but also note in the back, there are these holes for jam stoves. Another thing in the kitchen oftentimes were these sandstone sinks, say that 3 times real fast. And they were something that was common in larger kitchens of often much more substantial houses. They are a very rare survivor today, and they went out of favor also by really the end of the 1700s. And this is an example of at Ephrata. So jam stoves are another Germanic feature and really a critical driver of floor plans in earlier Pennsylvania German homes. So the drawing on the left shows how the stove was used. So this was put to the back of an existing fireplace. That's why you have a center chimney. You can't do this on a gable end of a house. It has to be somewhere in the interior of the home. So you would then, through the bottom hole, load firewood into the stove. There's an upper hole that would vent the stove of the smoke. It would go out of the common flue of the chimney, and then that would heat the room on the other side. If you look at this photo, that is the only intact 5-plate or jam stove that you'll see anywhere, and that's in Schifferstadt in Frederick, Maryland. And I think the date on the side of the stove is either 1756 or 1758, and it's a Lancaster County cast stove. So oftentimes only the scars remain. Like I said, there's only one that was intact, but there's a lot of places that suggest that stoves were used. So oftentimes what we see are holes. So in the picture on the right, you see that larger loading hole with the smoke hole leading to the flue above it. To the left is an example from Ephrata where there's a lot more left, but also this appears to be more than just a simple 5-plate stove. This appears to be something that probably was a combination of both iron and masonry on the top, again, to try to get more heat to radiate out into the room. So these are examples of stove supports. Both of those are cut out of sandstone. They're also both from eastern Lebanon County. There are other stove supports that are known. There's even one that's made out of wood that's in the Winter collection, but these are a pretty rare survivor. So as stove technology changed, so did the ability to then change how rooms are arranged. So this is an early 6-plate stove, and this had a pipe, so it could be moved anywhere in a room. So now you could move chimneys to an end of a house, and it's no longer an issue, opposed to jam stoves, which were, had to be fixed in place. So these are examples of a little bit later what's known as a 10-plate stoves. The extra plates gave a baking location, but also it created more surface area for better radiation of heat. And these were all cast in local furnaces as well. So heating fireplaces were also used. These are some examples in the Gamerling Rex House in Schifferstadt. You'll notice also, though, incorporated into the fireplace on the left, that there is a Franklin style stove. Very unusual. This is a stone carved fireplace surround from the 1750s Isaac Meyer house in Myerstown, PA. And this just shows a slightly different fireplace ornamentation. So you can see on the left-hand example, there is fully paneled, which you would see in kind of a better room in the house. This is in the same building. If you look to the right, is a much more simple overmantel. This is going to be more of a private room in the house. So because of the way that this is ornamented, we'd be able to tell how fancy the room is, and then also its use. So to give you an example, this is a paneled Georgian wall that includes cupboards along with the fireplace, and this is in charming forge near Wilmersdorf. Here's a slightly later example, also very similar, from the 1801 Fisher House that is in Oley. So you can see, even very basic to very fancy, some of the same things still here apply. So stairs, you need to be able to go from that first floor to the second floor. So there are many different examples of stairs. On the left, these are stairs that should look very familiar to folks from Ephrata. This is in the almondry and going up to the loft, but you'll see examples of stairs that look very similar to this in the earliest houses. Those that also wanted to save on space, the stairs there to the right, is it a winding stair. Oftentimes these are enclosed. This set here at one point was then opened up so you can see the entire stair. And of course, as houses got grander, so did the staircases. Hallways are often one of the places where the most showing off happens. And this is also in the Eggy house at Charming Forge, showing the lead up to going upstairs, and also from the landing showing going up to the second stairs. And the same thing in the Fisher House in Oley, which again, slightly later, about 1800, but still utilizing, very nice woodwork. These are just very different examples of stairs. Everything from the use of fairly decorative balusters to no balusters. You also have decorative cutouts on the end of the stairs. Oftentimes, the ones downstairs are fancier than the ones on the second floor. And if they go all the way up to the attic, those are oftentimes very, very plain. Something that is more dramatic that you do see in some rare houses are the use of flat balusters. And you have two examples that are here in houses, one of them in Gamerling Rex House, one of them in the Zimmerman Center, which is in York County. And again, even in the attic, this is an example that has turned balusters upstairs. So this is something that usually extends up to the house. Oftentimes, though, they do get simpler as they go higher into the house where fewer people are going to see them. So doors are another ornament that you'll see. This is in the Lice House in Berks County. You'll notice the raised panels. That's something that you'll see really from about the middle of the 18th century on. And I've heard all kinds of stories behind why we have paneled doors. That, believe me, they're just for ornamentation. It's the way that people that are high-end carpenters would go ahead and make them. They're easily joined. It's a way of making a door out of smaller pieces of wood. A more decorative example in a house that was located in Berks County. This is now demolished when Blue Marsh was built. And notice on the raised panels, that extra ornamentation that was put there. And there are even some examples that would have that with paint. This is the Schaffer House, the Alexander Schaffer House in Schifferstadt. And you can see that there's a great differentiation in the way that doors and door surrounds were done. A very simple example on the left from a 1730s home. One used much more classical architecture in the charming Forge Mansion from the 1780s. Hardware is also something that was utilized through these houses. We need something for those doors to hang on. And so you have things that were very basic as far as the ironware that was put on, like these thumb latches. You also then have different types of decorative hinges. These are all mid-18th century examples, more mid-18th century examples. And in some cases, you'll have different style of hinges all in the same house. All of these were blacksmith made locally. And these are some examples of what were used as far as escutcheons, where the keyhole would cover, and also for latches. The escutcheon for the box lock on the right, that's all pierced work that's there. So this was something that was really the high end of blacksmith art that you could see expressed in many of these houses. So storage is also always something that would be necessary in a house. The example on the left is about the most basic storage that you can get. And this is in one of the cells at Ephrata, where you have a corner shelf and also a pegboard to be able to put things in. The example on the right is a built-in that's kind of the same thing. It's actually a small kind of built-in, almost a shrunk or a clothing chest that's in this house that's in Berks County, the Lice House. Some other examples of other built-in furniture in that exact same house, both on the first floor and the second floor. This is in the stove room or the stuba on the first floor. That would be kind of their parlor. And then the better bedroom typically was above that on the second floor in a house of this style. And that's where this other one occurs. And note, these are rat tail hinges. Even though this is probably a 1780 house, they're using a fairly early and a little bit more of a Germanic type of hinge for that door for the cupboard. So there are also, of course, built-in corner cupboards. On the right-hand side, you can see this example. This dates, or this is in the Wentz house in Montgomery County. Note the paint, that's what the house is really known for, is the reconstruction of the paint that was in there, and the build-in on the left. Oftentimes in stone houses, they would have these built-in cupboards that would actually be directly in the stone wall. Sometimes they're small, sometimes they're a little bit larger, sometimes they're in the chimney, but here's another good example. So that was a lot of ground to cover. We could have spent another couple of hours on that, but obviously you all want to go to bed at some point. So I'd like to open it up for any questions that any of the viewers might have.
Thanks, Mike. That was really great, informative. Give a little taste of some of the things you can see if you go on the upstairs tours at Ephrata. We currently are having a new roof put on the bakery. They run out of shingles and have to go make some more to finish it up, but they have the majority of it done. So that is being done in a side lap shingle, as Mike described.
And that's a great opportunity to see how those roofs are put on, to be able to see that installed.
Oldest log house in Lancaster County. Any ideas?
Log houses are incredibly difficult, of course, to date, because the technology was used over a very long time period and very little of it changed. So really the only way that it could be done well would be to dendro date the logs. Again, there are very few that have dates on them. it actually, usually when people talk about log houses, they always throw at times what are these very, very early dates on them. There are log houses that are still being built in the 1840s. So oftentimes when people see log, they equate that to early. And oftentimes it is at least earlier than the Civil War, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's early. I've never heard anyone go ahead and say that they believe that was the oldest log house in Lancaster County. I would suspect that if there's one standing, it would probably be from like the 1730s, 1740s period. I know that oftentimes there's a very early date put on, is it the Byerland Church south of Lancaster? Oftentimes gets assigned a very early date. But there's not really a house that I know of that has, a good firm date on that's known in the county. But it's probably, again, 1730s to about 1750 time period. Before that, it's challenging to have the logs survive for that long, particularly if they were left exposed for any length of time.
What was the reason for doing an upright corner beam in log houses over the overlapping logs?
Okay, so this is a question about the corner post log houses. So in many ways, that was a hybrid between a half timbered house and a log house. So a typical log house that had, corner notches is far easier to build. But again, I think these were folks that were kind of navigating. It's like, well, I want to build the way we normally did back in Germany using half timber. That's what I know. But we're going to use this material that's here and very common, which is log. So they were not easy to build at all, because every one of those logs had to have a mortise cut on the end, or a tenon cut on the end, and a mortise into those upright logs. So in my mind, it was kind of a nightmare to build. I know that friends of mine that were working on restoring a log house in Strasbourg, I believe it was Barge Tavern. And one of the problems was that one of the corner posts had gone bad. And then they had to figure out, how do you just take the corner post out with all of these other logs that tie into it? Because normally with a log house, if you need to replace a log, it's relatively simple. You go ahead and you bolt some things on the outside of the house. You could use a car jack to jack the building up, pull the bad log out, put a new one in. That was far more complicated. So again, I think it was something where they were using some parts of the traditional German construction techniques, but melding that with kind of this American building material and style. And it came up with this very strange hybrid. Again, it's not a very common way of building a log house, but you do see it.
Can you say anything about the center knobs on doors at Schifferstadt?
That is a very early way of making door closures. So what the person is asking about is that typically you would have a raised panel door with 5 panels, and there would be a center pull on that, and it would have this really decorative escutcheon plate. It would be then a large, I think typically they're iron pulls, and they would be in the center of doors. They actually show up in other locations. There's several examples where you could see the ghosts of them down in the Germantown area. There's a house south of Schafferstown that has the same. And if you go into the Barnes Museum and look at some of the ironwork that's on the walls there, some of the escutcheons of those center pulls are actually worked into the art display at the Barnes. And it was just an early kind of a Baroque way of doing closure. It's high style. It's not kind of the peasant's way of doing it. So in some of those earlier style buildings, they're just, again, it's a replication of what they're doing in kind of a higher style house in Germany, and they're doing it here. So it's something that shows up in a relatively small grouping of buildings as it survives today. But I believe it would have been more common, particularly in areas that grew in affluence earlier. so the earlier settled parts of the Pennsylvania German areas.
So we have another question here. You talked a great deal about houses in Ole. Are any of them accessible to us, or any of them open to the public?
Very few of the houses that I talked about are open to the public to go into. However, there is an excellent book that was put out by the Pennsylvania German Society in the mid-1990s, written by an author by the name of Phil Pendleton. And Phil wrote a book on Ole in which he illustrated most of the houses. Matter of fact, probably all the houses that I did. So between that book and the Ole Valley Preservation Society, they put out a driving map of some of the buildings. So it is out there and available if you wanted to go look at it. There are some of the buildings that are, at least one, the Keim House, I think I had an interior view of it, and at least one of the headers over a window that is sometimes open. It's owned by the Berks Preservation Trust. So if you were to Google that, they typically have an open house there once or twice a year. Well worth going to see that building. I think that dates around 1753, great big stone house, very intact. It also has a very interesting 18th century cider press that's on site that is also very rare survivor and well worth going to see.
I did note that Peter Wentz Farmstead that you showed several times is open to the public.
Oh, yes.
That's operated by the county of Montgomery County. It's one of Montgomery County's historic sites, and it is definitely worth a visit. It's the reproduced paint schemes. Who would have thought a white with black polka dot kitchen? So
And-
I really encourage you to go take a day trip and go over to Montgomery County if you're local and go and see the Peter Wentz.
It's well worth going to see,
it's well
Elizabeth. I
worth it.
certainly, echo that if you've never seen the house, it's worth seeing. They do a fantastic job of interpreting the property, and just for the paint alone, it's worth the trip, but there's far more than that. And paint decoration like that was very, very common. That's the thing, is that oftentimes when we think of the interior of these houses, it's the watered down version, but most of these houses had some very vibrant, almost riotous colors in the inside of them and wild paint schemes.
What was the faux finish applied on the door a few slides back?
So there were a couple of them. So there was a slide that had the interior of the Lice House, and that was just a faux wood grain finish that was on that door. And that's something that's fairly common. You'll see some faux finishes that are put on. The other one was the interior of the Schaffer house that had those I think there are 8-pointed stars or 6-pointed stars that were there. Looked very much like, so-called hex signs that of course aren't, but that's what's on there, and that's all rendered in paint.
Okay. Was it common to put a dated cornerstone in early stone houses, and did they use it as sort of a time capsule?
Typically in the earliest of stone houses, you do not see a date stone, at least in the corner. Date stones are very typically between windows on the second floor of the house, either in a single or in pairs. If it is like a Georgian home, they didn't want to break up the symmetry, so on either side of that central window, oftentimes you'll have a pair of them. And those are solid. Those don't, they're not like, the bank in 1901 that puts in a date stone that's, hollow inside, and then there's a time capsule put inside. So these tend to be just a solid stone. Oftentimes the people's names, or at least their initials on the outside, a date, sometimes there are sayings on them as well. Patrick Dunmoyer actually does a great talk just on date stones on Pennsylvania German buildings.
So someone started on I guess it's a TV program, a program called Restoration Road, that some builders put shoes in the rafters. Have you ever heard of this?
Yes. There are these kind of ritual concealments that are put into buildings. And sometimes it's shoes, sometimes it's coins. Sometimes there are kind of powwow talismans that are put into them. There's all kinds of different things that kind of show up in houses. I've actually seen several examples of shoes, though, that have been early shoes pulled out of houses, either in rafters or in other locations in the house.
Okay, let's see, that's mine. And I think we may have reached the end here. I'm just typing a comment to someone here. Let me finish that. Mike, I have to say, this took me back. My advisor at Westchester was Richard Webster, who has written several
Yes.
books. So it was really a joy listening to this, brought back good memories of his classes. In fact, I think I just finally threw out my notebooks. I had typed up and made drawings and pasted in pictures and everything, but I think I just recently got rid of those. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Reminder, earlier on, I pasted the link in the chat box for tickets for the upstairs tours for Saturday. If you wanted to go ahead and book your tours now, you can do that online. You will need a reservation. We will fill up the upstairs tours as people come in during the day, but if you want to be assured of a spot on an upstairs tour, it's best to book ahead. You can call us at the site, or you can do it online with a link, and all that information is on our website. I'll also give a plug for October 23rd and 30th. Those are Sunday afternoons. We will be doing tours of God's Acres Cemetery beginning at 2 o'clock. Also on our website is more information about those and how to order some tickets online there as well. Those are also limited availability. So thank you all very much for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you on November 10th, our next virtual academy. Have a good evening, everyone.